Slay. Amazing. She is the moment.
Yeah.
Get up, queen.
That'll be enough.
Hello and welcome back to my channel. This week I am finishing off my Ray costume that I started a couple of weeks ago. And by finishing I mean tackling all the accessories like her shoes, her bag, the arm wraps, the belt, those sorts of things. If you wanted to see how I made all the other pieces, I'll link the video down below and up here somewhere. But without any further ado, let's dive on in. I have previously had a Ray costume. Last time I did the arm wraps, I literally just had the bandages and wrapped them up my arms. The issue after wearing it for a little amount of time is that the bandages tend to separate or fall down. So this time I wanted to try and prevent that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a sock base and then I'm going to wrap the bandages around that and sew them in place. Theoretically, it should work. First I started off with 2 lots of crepe bandages. And as you can see, they're completely white here, but I did dye them in last week's video. And I have some not quite skin coloured spandex left over from my Sailor Scout costume, which I intend to make arm socks from. Which is what I'm doing here. So I take the measurement of my bicep and wrist and I mark those out on the spandex, and then for whatever reason here I decided to take those measurements and cut them in half because I thought my spandex was stretchy enough. Spoiler alert, it was not stretchy enough, and you'll see the result of that soon. Then I take the bandage and I put it in at the wrist and fold the spandex around it, making sure to only catch that little edge that I've put in the wrist there. Then I sew up that edge using a stretch stitch on my machine. So I don't know if you can see the slight colour difference in my hand, but I sewed this too tight and it's now cutting off circulation to my hand. So let's try that again and make it a little bit larger this time. So after redoing the arm sock a little bit looser this time, I then begin wrapping and pinning the bandages in place. This was incredibly difficult to do by myself, by the way. Next I move on to hand stitching along the edge of the wraps, making sure to catch the spandex underneath so that they don't move. I started doing this at the wrist and working my way up the arm, but as soon as I got to the elbow I very quickly realised I was not going to be able to do the upper arm myself. So I found this tea jar that had the same measurement as my bicep and I put the sock on that and just continued the process until the whole thing was done. For the arm cuff, all I'm doing is once again using a pattern that I found on Pinterest and tracing it out onto some actual leather and then cutting that out. Simple. For the base belt, I brought this 5cm wide strip of leather. Now unfortunately this isn't quite wide enough, I needed something that was 6.5cm wide. However, it was all I could source on such a short deadline, so I have to make do with it. I also have 4 D-rings and some twine. Let's get on to crafting. I found this image on Pinterest which I'm using as a reference to make my own Ray belt. However, because my leather strip wasn't wide enough, I have to do my best to sort of fit those measurements onto the leather. And that means that my belt ends up looking a lot skinnier overall than it should. However, I do plan to remake it in the future when I can find some appropriately sized leather. Next I marked where the slots in the hole should be and I passed it off to my dad, who very helpfully punched those out for me because I do not have leather working tools. I really should invest in some at this point. Anyway, then I slide the D-rings on to the end and then I stitch it up using some twine. Lastly, I just wrap and tie some twine in place to match where she has some on her belt. I hate making shoes. I don't know why I thought it was a good idea to make shoes, but hey, I'm here making shoes again for this costume. The first time I made Ray, I also made the shoes for it, and I remember how difficult it was back then. For this, I'm basically just going to draft my own pattern, which once I figure out how to scan it into the computer, I will make it available for free on my website, so make sure to check that out. Reshoot pattern. I basically just plan to draw out the shapes that I can see in the Pozu ones, transfer it to a paper, and then go from there. So let's make some shoes.
I bought these shoes to use as the base because they have a hemp rope in the sole, and that means I can stitch straight into them. I found this brown wool to use as the outer part of the shoe, and this white woolen scarf from the op shop that's seen better days to use as the lining. Here's some brown leather I had on hand. Now I wish this was slightly darker, but time crunch and this is all I had. And finally some leather thonging. So the first thing I did was liberate the soles from the shoe uppers.
Okay, so here is the pattern drafted from paper. As you can see, it looks like a boot, right? So I'm going to now cut it out of the real fabrics and just, you know, hope and pray that it actually goes together like a boot.
First I cut all of the pattern pieces out of the brown wool. And then again out of the scarf. The first piece I sew together is the front tongue of the boot. And then I sew up the heel of the lining. Next I sew the heel of the lining into the front part of the boot. With all the lining pieces sewn together, I then change the thread colour and sew up the tongue of the brown wool. Because the brown fabric is quite thick, I cut out a triangle here just to help the curve lay a bit better. I also trim back this seam here just so that it's easier to sew it to the lining fabric. After sewing in the lining, I trim back the seam so that it's as close to it as possible just to remove some of the bulk when I turn it right way out. Next I cut out a 3 cm wide strip of leather which will go on the back tongue of the boot. After sewing the strip of leather to the back wool part of the boot, I then fold down the tabs at the top so they don't get caught and sew the lining to it. Next it's time to cut the heel pieces out of some brown leather, so first I trace out the shapes and then I cut them. Then I sew the pieces together along the curved edge here. Then I take 2 more 3 cm wide strips of leather, one with a curved edge, and I place them in the centre back of the heel piece and sew them on. First I do just the straight piece, and then I do the piece with the curve, and I make sure to start 1 cm down from the edge so that it's got a little tab which comes in handy later. Next the heel pieces get laid on top of the brown wool and stitched in place. Now it's time to add the lining to the bottom half of the shoe. I do this by sewing them together using a 1 cm seam along the top edge. After the bottom half of the shoe is turned right side out, I pin the tongues to the top edge and begin to sew them in place.
So I just super broke a sewing needle on my machine, and not only was it a sewing needle, it was a leather needle, and I actually lost it down in the machine, so I had to take the whole thing apart to try and find it. And yeah, couldn't actually find the tip of the needle, got everything else out, but tip of the needle's in there somewhere, couldn't get it out. It is what it is. Anyway, put the machine back together, started sewing it again, immediately break another needle on it. I don't know why it's doing this. The fabric's not that thick. I think what's happening is it's slightly shifting the needle, so instead of going straight down, it's going in on an angle and then smashing up on the plate. So I just spent the last hour actually hand stitching the, what do you call it, the tall boot part into the boot. So that was fun. Now I have to repeat that process for the other boot. Wonderful. Anyway, here is how one of them's looking. It's nice. You can barely see the seam. That's where I've sewn it by hand along there. So I'm happy with that.
Let's just repeat it for the other side now.
So I've just done that thing that I do when the sewing gets mildly difficult and I stop filming because I really need to concentrate on what I'm doing, but I have finished one shoe. I'm really happy with how it's turned out because I don't know about you guys, but I think this looks like an actual shoe that you may be able to buy at a store. Not a high-end store, but a store nonetheless. I did figure out some things that I need to do differently when I go ahead and finish off the second shoe, and that's things like sewing the tabs to the tongue before it gets sewn to the rest of the shoe, because my god, that was difficult to try and push a whole shoe through my sewing machine. Anyway, how about I show you how to finish the shoe by now making the other shoe.
First, I cut out 4 1.5 centimeter wide leather strips. Then I added a top stitching detail along the edge in a contrasting thread. Then I measured up 1.5 inches on the tongue and prepared to sew the leather strip in place. I then repeat this process with all 4 tabs.
So the back part, this tongue bit here, I actually have to sew in by hand because for whatever reason, this part right here, like I'm not even sewing it to leather, I'm sewing it to the wool on the inside. That is the part that kept snapping the needles. So I did the other one by hand and I'll be doing this one by hand.
After the top parts of the boot are sewn in place, I then sew a 2 centimeter hem along the bottom edge of the boot. I then trim the wool lining as close to that stitch that I just made as possible. And that's so that there will be less bulk in the seam when I turn those edges and pin them to the sole of the shoe. After the boot has been completely pinned in place to the sole, I then begin hand stitching, and my goodness, this is such a hand killer.
My hands are so incredibly sore from all of the hand sewing that I've just done.
Like, look at the state of this finger. Oh my goodness.
Never again. But both of the shoes are finished. Let me show you what they look like. The bag. So Ray's bag is a modified British World War II army bag. So I brought a British World War II army bag and I intend to modify it. I found this pattern on Pinterest which I'm going to try and work to fit mine. I also brought some heavy duty jeans needles for my machine here and some upholstery thread, which is what I'm going to be sewing it all with, so fingers crossed my machine can actually handle it.
I also brought an Alice clip because she has one of those on the front. So the first thing I have to do to the bag is attempt to unpick it all, and this was incredibly difficult. Once all the pieces were separated, I then began transferring the pattern pieces by drawing them onto the appropriate parts of the bag.
Sorry, I got in the zone and started sewing it together, but this is just the lid, and it was basically the 2 smaller lid pieces sewn to the shorter length rectangle onto making the bottom half of the pouch now.
I also saved some of the pre-made hardware pieces like these clips from the original bag, and I'm now sewing them to the side piece of my new bag. Once the clips are sewn in place, I then attach the front and back pieces of the bag. Once the front and back pieces are on, I then sew the lid to one side. Then I add some straps onto the back of the bag, and these become loops that the belt can go through. I'm actually placing them a little bit too high here, and I do shift them down further later on.
It's not the prettiest, but at the very least it's a bag, and I mean she's a scavenger, so does it really need to be pretty? All that's left to do now is to sew that on there, and she done.
I lied. I decided the unfinished edge of the top of the bag here was too ugly, so I went and brought out some beige webbing and I just folded that in half and sewed it in place. So there you have it. That is how I made all of the bits and pieces for my Rey Skywalker costume. I'm really happy with how it turned out. I think the thing I'm most proud of is the little bag thing. I wasn't sure if my sewing machine was actually going to be able to handle sewing the thick canvas, but it did it. Actually no, I didn't break any needles on it. It was surprising. It was very practical at the convention and very much recommend having. And super stoked with the shoes. Oh my gosh, they were so comfy. I spent a whole entire con day in them and my back didn't hurt, my feet weren't sore. They were so comfortable and so warm. The arm wraps, if I were to do those again, I'd put elastic actually in the top, because I did find after wearing it for a long amount of time they did actually start to slip. So a little bit of elastic would give it a bit more squish on the arms. And as I said earlier when actually making the belt in the video, mine wasn't quite wide enough, so I would like to replace it with a wider, accurate belt in the future. This one was just a little bit too skinny, but overall happy with it. If you like what you saw here today, do consider chucking a like down below if you really liked it, maybe even a comment, and if you really liked it, maybe even consider subscribing. I do a lot of sewing, crafting and fun related things here on this channel, and I usually try and upload every week or so. With all that being said, I'll see you guys next week. Goodbye!